Hello, everyone. This is recording number 3 for Plato, a class on the Republic. Today, I want to talk about the beginning of Book 2, where Glaucon lays out a distinction between 3 kinds of goods. And even though it is Glaucon and not Socrates who is laying this out, scholars tend to take it quite seriously. And the distinction is treated as an important contribution to metaethics or the metaphysics of value. So here's how it goes. The first kind of good, as Glaucon puts this, is one that we desire for its own sake. And the examples are joy and harmless pleasures, where the thought is that nothing follows. There's just a kind of harmless pleasure. We desire it for its own sake. That's it. The second kind of good is what we desire for its own sake, but also for what comes from it. And the third kind of good is what we desire only for the sake of what comes from it. And for this third kind of good, the examples are medicine and exercise. And so the thought is, for example, that one doesn't desire a medication for its own sake, but for the sake of the way in which it alleviates an illness, let's say. Now, the most complicated category is the mixed category, the second one, where we desire something for its own sake, but also for the sake of what comes from it. And the two initial examples here are health and seeing, but justice is also placed in that category. So justice presumably is something that we desire for its own sake, but also for the sake of what comes from it. What that means is really contested. And I want to work towards an interpretation, or at least a sketch of what we may think Plato is up to here, by discussing two aspects that are not always attended to. The first of these aspects is that Glaucon introduces each of these 3 kinds of goods by reference to how we desire it, or how we love it, or like it, or pursue it. And that actually speaks to a fundamental dimension of Plato's conception of goodness, that the good is the object of desire. If we think about other dialogues, for example, the Symposium, this is something that Plato has a lot to say about, that really what the good is it is the object of love or the object of desire. Or at least that is one dimension of what he has to say about the nature of goodness. And we should keep this in mind as we work our way toward later books of the Republic, where we are going to think about the form of the good. Because once we think about the form of the good, it may seem that the good is something that is entirely separate from our sphere in which we have affections and desires and so on. And at that point, it is important not to forget that the good is the object of desire. That leads me to my second observation about something that is tricky and not always fully discussed. Often, scholars don't attend to this notion of desire or to the role of desire in Glaucon's proposal, because it is kind of tempting to rephrase what Glaucon is saying immediately in terms of a modern distinction, namely the distinction between intrinsic value and instrumental value. It can seem that the 3 categories, something that we desire for its own sake, something that we desire for its own sake and for the sake of what comes from it, and then something that we desire for the sake of what comes from it, that maybe all of this could be rephrased in terms of, well, some things have intrinsic value, some things have instrumental value, and some things have both. But if we talk in these terms, we've somehow lost sight of the dimension of desire, that is part of what Glaucon proposes. And that actually is the common denominator of what he says, or one common denominator of what he says about each of these kinds of goods. Moreover, and that is something that scholars have started to discuss in recent years, both notions that figure in the modern distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value have the potential to be genuinely misleading here. Why is that? When we think about intrinsic value, we might think that, well, when something has intrinsic value, that is somehow about it in and of itself. It is not about something that it does. It is not about something that it generates. It is just about something being what it is and having intrinsic value. And maybe that is not necessarily what one must think about intrinsic value, but it is a kind of intuition that is somehow implicit when people talk about intrinsic value. Now, when we talk, however, with Glaucon about justice or health or seeing being valued for its own sake, it is not clear, and in fact not compelling, that that is what's at issue. If we think a little bit kind of ahead to Book 4 of the Republic, where we get an account, or at least the beginnings of an account of justice, then we see that justice does something. Justice is a power in the soul. Justice generates and sustains the other virtues, and it orders the soul. So justice does something. And that is, however, what justice itself does. So when we value justice or desire justice for its own sake, we desire it under the description that it is a power which generates something, rather than that it is just something that is without any kind of causal role. So now we have a picture where valuing justice for its own sake already involves some kind of causal bringing about of something, namely the sustaining of the other virtues and ordering of the soul. And then we can ask, well, if that is the dimension of justice that we value when we value it for its own sake, then what are these things that we value when we value justice for the sake of what comes from it? Because we seem to have talked already about something that somehow comes from it. It orders the soul. So that is a question and a genuine puzzle that scholars have only really brought to light in quite recent contributions to the literature, and that is only kind of visible once we set aside the terminology of intrinsic and instrumental value. And now it seems like we are talking somehow about two kinds of things that justice brings about. Justice brings about an ordering of the soul and the other virtues, but then it also brings about something else. And what is this other thing that it brings about? Well, one example might be that someone may have a good reputation on account of being just, and that is something outside of the soul. So I will leave it here. The upshot of what I'm saying is that this is a passage in ancient philosophy where it is quite important to, at least initially, read the text on its own terms and kind of just pause a bit before we introduce modern terminology and modern distinctions, because some of the most interesting things that Plato has to say are not visible if we rephrase his ideas too quickly in terms of distinctions that today we are more familiar with.